camera angle, I'm gonna stop.
You don't like the camera angle?
I'll survive.
Come on, look how pasty I am on it. You think you got problems? I got problems.
Oh no, this wasn't right. Are we singing? Can I sing Rihanna?
I'm singing because I'm happy and my father's here.
Are we live?
I don't know. I don't know anymore.
I was trying to recreate the Elf. Have you ever seen the Elf movie when he starts singing because his dad thinks he's a Graham, like a holiday Graham?
The one with Will Ferrell?
Yeah.
Bits and pieces.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Keep it that way. It's a terrible movie.
I do like the movie Bad Santa.
I don't think I ever saw Bad Santa. Is it good?
Mm-hmm. And speaking of Will Ferrell,
Video is live.
All right.
Officially. Apparently it already was.
It's
For
good.
13 minutes.
by the other guys.
At least I think I had the mics off. I think.
You think so?
I don't remember.
We're going to find out. We're going to go home and we're going to see that video, and it's going to be amazing.
No,
I'm pretty sure my mic was off, at least.
Super funny. Life is full of hiccups. What can you do?
All right.
All right.
Guys, ready?
Yeah.
I think I want to go on a Will Ferrell movie marathon.
Some classics. Step Brothers.
Oh my God, yes. Oh, you know what song I want to sing when they're on the boat? That's all I have to say.
I'm on a boat and it's going fast and I got another boat.
Boats and
On a boat like Leo.
What's the rest?
What is wrong with you two?
Oh, that was Lonely Island.
Yes, it was Lonely
No,
Island.
I'm talking about when they were on the
I just
boat.
heard boat and I got excited.
I can't say the rest of it, but it was actually really funny. It had a little beat.
I know which song.
We should go to Jolly Nooner. We should all go to Jolly Nooner.
Oh, boy. I went there like 2 years ago.
All right, you ready for this? Hello and welcome to Right on 14th. This is your host, Mike Parr.
And Christina Caramo.
We have a very special show for you guys today. We have a great interview with Gloria Greenfield. She's going to be joining us here in a couple minutes. So in the meantime, we're just going to get to know each other a little bit better. Christina, how you doing today?
I am okay. Had a nice and long day. Happy with the weather.
Yeah.
I know that's the most obnoxious small talk people ever make.
That is the most obnoxious small talk I've ever heard.
I went to the riverfront. What day was that? A couple of days ago, and it was so nice. It was nice and crowded, and
I mean, that's the riverfront for you, right?
It was beautiful.
Nobody's ever said that about Detroit.
I'm loving downtown. I am. And there's a robotics competition, going on at Cobo.
Why don't we talk about your candidacy? Because you're running for 2 positions, right? In addition to just being elected as precinct delegate being elected to the executive board for the 14th Congressional District.
Yes, so I am running for precinct delegate, and I'm also running for county commissioner in the 10th district.
That's a big deal.
Yes, and so I would appreciate your support. I don't know what all we can say.
I won't support you. It's because I'm not in the 10th.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So I don't know what all we can say, considering we can't endorse too many candidates. I know somebody else, another Republican, is running.
Oh, there is.
In the primary, yes. I don't know. I forgot the person's name. So we do have to mention it, I guess, in the for
sake
integrity.
of equality.
Yes,
yep,
in the sake
definitely.
of equality. I'm sure they're a fantastic person.
Yes.
But I don't know how much I can self-promote at this moment on the show. But I am running, and I'm the bomb. So I'll just leave it like that.
Well, everybody knows that you're the bomb.
It's no secret.
It is important to the show, right, for us to maintain some equity in all the candidates.
For sure.
That's going to be important going forward too, definitely.
Yeah, and I'm sure the person is a great person.
Right.
Okay, so
So how did you meet Gloria Greenfield, our host that's our interviewee who's going to call in here any minute now?
Well, actually, Eugene, one of our fellow 14th district persons, told me that he knew her, and he put us in touch through email. So we're really excited to interview her. I don't know if we want to go ahead and introduce her because she should be calling in soon. So the documentary is The Fight of Our Lives, Defeating the Ideological War Against the West. So she's done some other documentaries on mass Judeophobia, Body and Soul, and
she's calling in right now.
Yeah, she's calling in right now.
Hello.
Hey, Gloria.
Yep. This is. Hi. How are you?
Good. We are live on air currently. Are you ready to do an interview?
I am.
Fantastic timing. We were just in the middle of the introduction when you called in, so let's pick up where we left off. Is that Gloria Greenfield is the producer and the director for an upcoming documentary, The Fight of Our Lives, defeating the ideological war against the West. She's also produced several other films, such as Unmasked Judophobia, Body and Soul, The State of the Jewish Nation, and The Case for Israel, Democracy's Outpost. So The Fight of Our Lives, Christina and I have been very lucky. We got to see a pre-screening of the pre-screening, which is pretty cool. And it's kind of a documentary about the cultural war against the West. And it's what am I trying to say here? And it's a fight against the West's most important institutions, like the media and the universities, and really just the public square in general. And so the film's recently been awarded the Remy Award at the 51st Annual WorkFest Houston International Film Festival. And you can see a preview of this on our Facebook page when we post it to Right on 14th at Facebook. And then there is a very exciting pre-screening of it in West Bloomfield on May 7th. Gloria will, of course, be there at the screening for a Q&A session, so that'll be very cool. Come check it out. And, of course, Christina and I will be there, too. So very excited about the movie in general and about having Gloria on the show today. So thank you for calling in.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Definitely. So we had a lot of questions after seeing this documentary. It was very good, by the way. And the first thing is, why make the movie at all? What really motivated you to make this and to bring into this topic specifically?
Well, my previous work, the films that you mentioned, focused on the Jewish state and also on the threat to the Jewish people, the resurgence of lethal Jew hatred in regions around the world, and how that was emanating from Islamist movements. And when after my third film came out, after Body and Soul was released in October of 2014, and I was traveling throughout North America and Europe and South Africa and Israel, during the conversations that I would have with the audience, in conjunction with growing concern on my part about the situation in the West, in Western institutions, the assault that we were seeing, anti-Western assault on and penetration into universities and the public square and politics. I started thinking and realized that we really needed to look at a larger context. We can't ignore the fact that in addition to the resurgence of lethal Jew hatred, so I'm talking about threats and actual growing cases of Jews being murdered, especially in France and some other European countries. There's also on a daily basis, murder of Christians in Muslim countries, and unfortunately, spreading to Europe, and so it forced me to really think about what was happening, and I thought it was really important to start examining what this assault on Western tradition was all about. Where did it begin? What was its intention? And so I decided that needed to be the next film. That the next film had to take a broader look at what was going on in the West that was making Westerners and Western values so vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry?
No. I'm sorry. Continue. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay. And so I began interviewing. I did research on the leading experts in a variety of aspects of this, and it became clear. Look, Western civilization is founded on the values emanating from the Hebrew Bible. It's founded on Judeo-Christian values. And when we look at the Western ideas about law and morality and social justice, it's clear that, yes, that they come from the Hebrew Bible. And then it starts making sense, because if there has been and continues to be an assault on Western civilization, then the only way that enemies of the West, anti-Western groups and individuals, the only way that they have a shot at destroying the West is by destroying Judeo-Christian values, by persecuting and demonizing Jews and Christians, Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah.
And so then one has to understand that there's no possibility of ending, or at least tempering or managing the resurgence of Jew hatred, so that it's not at a lethal level. And there's no shot at protecting Christians who are being murdered for their beliefs if we do it in silos. You can't end hatred when it's in the midst of a war to destroy the civilization that emanates from those theological systems. So there's more than just the assault on Jews and Christians, and I don't mean to be trivializing or diminishing other minorities who are being murdered and assaulted, like the Yazidis and others, but we're talking about Western civilization. So my focus is on Jews and Christians from that perspective. So there's also, let's look at what the values are of when we say Western values, that Western tradition is being threatened by these anti-Western forces. So we're talking about values like the freedoms of speech, assembly, and worship. We're talking about the assault on liberty, which is the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions, whether imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. We're talking about an assault on rule of law, which leads to anarchy. We're talking about, freedom, political freedoms, economic freedoms, equality before the law, separation of church and state. So when we look at all of those factors, it then becomes, I think it becomes very clear, and the scholars that I interviewed and the experts that I interviewed had the same understanding that this is a war against the West. And it's a war, it's an ideological war against the West. And we don't have a shot at winning this war. And by winning this war, it means sustaining and protecting our Western institutions, our way of life, protecting our freedom and democracy, our freedom of speech, our freedom of expression, our freedom of assembly, our freedom to defend ourselves. So that's why I made the film.
No, that's fantastic. And I think that's definitely something that can resonate very well with a lot of the people in the 14th Congressional District. They see everything that's happening all the way from Mosul with the attacks on Christians to France with the attacks on the Jews and everything in between, where there's just this a real hatred against religion, it seems like, in the West. And it comes from outside a lot of the times, but it also comes from the left a lot of the times. And so it's interesting that we're getting attacked on both sides in that kind of way. Christina, I know you have a lot to
No,
say on
it's,
the topic.
yeah.
What? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say you're absolutely right that there's sort of a two-pronged assault on Christians and Jews coming from, there's the secular assault, and then there's the jihadist assault. The jihadist assault, that wants to have the entire world dominated by Islam, living under Sharia law. And then you have the secularists that say that there's no such thing as God, that man creates, not God, and you have some very terrible things that come out of that. And also, even and also for secularists who aren't attacking religion and want to live in the West, they're being assaulted by their other freedoms, as we all are. The freedom of speech. We're not allowed anymore, or I should say that it becomes very difficult in this environment if one does not subscribe to the so-called progressive narrative. It becomes very difficult for us to speak truth. One has to have tremendous determination and courage to speak openly, and at a time when if one says something or one points to the increasing terror in the West that is emanating from Islamist movements, then then you're called an Islamophobe. You're called an Islamophobe for speaking truth. One is not talking about Muslims in general. We're talking about Islamist extremism. Islamist refers to the extremists.
And I think that's an important distinction, right? Is that we're not against a religion as a whole or the people of the religion, but rather the extremist part of the religion that is ideologically incompatible with a lot of Western values, right? And how that ideology is actively waging a war against the West and how harmful that is to our institutions. So that is a fantastic point, I think, to bring up.
Yeah, I mean, what we're talking about is a minority of the Muslim world that's extremist. The problem is that the Muslim world is so big that a minority is still millions and millions of people.
Right.
And so we have millions and millions of people who are of Muslims who have become radicalized and become extremists and are actually imperialists. I mean, it's really quite amazing to me that the progressive movement's always talking about Western imperialism while they're in bed with extremists, with Islamists who want to destroy the West and install Sharia law throughout the world. And then not acknowledging that the imperialism are the Islamists who want to take over the world, who actually say publicly that Sharia law should rule the world. Well, that's imperialism.
Yeah, and
So,
yeah, I was going to say, it's really interesting what you're saying. It's true. I was looking at an article in the New York Post. It was published back in January, and they mentioned a few imams, like one imam in Houston we should fight the Jews, he said. Another imam out of Raleigh, North Carolina, invoked the same Jew-killing hadith, saying the Muslim prophet gave us glad tidings that we will fight those Jews until the rocks and the trees will speak. I mean, it's just several, like you said, a lot of them, they say it publicly and they're unapologetic about it. And the weird part is how the political left, they have this kind of, like you mentioned, kind of like this bizarre marriage between one another. And then they talk bad about Judeo-Christian values, but then embrace Islam, and it's like that doesn't make any sense. Really quick, Gloria, something really interesting that you mentioned in the film. Somebody mentioned in the film about like the common theme that these Islamist extremists have in common with the secularists is their hatred for Judeo-Christian values. Like somebody
Yeah.
mentioned Nietzsche and the guy Saeed Qutb, one of the founding members of the Muslim Brotherhood, which a lot of people are not familiar with the Muslim Brotherhood and who they are. Could you talk about that a little bit about like even though they both would ultimately want to take over the other one, but they've kind of united in their hatred for Judeo-Christian values?
Yeah, well, this isn't very different than what happened during the Second World War. There was an alliance between Hitler and the SS with Islamist leaders, and to the point where Hitler actually wrote a letter to Islamist leaders, assuring them that they are considered Aryans, that they're not considered inferior people by the Nazis, and the Islamists in the Middle East at that time were working on plans to set up death camps in the Middle East to exterminate the Jews in the Middle East. So it's not a new phenomena that we see these sort of alliances between fascists and fascists at one pole and fascists at another pole. Because if we're talking about the progressive movement today, I call them fascists.
They are.
Because when you have a movement that is tries to censor the voices of people who don't agree with them, who threaten to murder, or it's actually really very alarming that even on TV, on sort of the so-called comedy shows, and in public squares, on TV, you can watch somebody make horrible, comments about the president and how he should be killed or murdered or whatever, and it's just accepted. That's a really, really frightening thing. And I do believe that the erosion of tolerance that's coming from the progressive towards people who don't agree with them is an outcome. It's totalitarian thinking, and it's like 1980s. It's really like, I don't mean to trivialize this, but it is. It's just like 1984 with newspeak, with deflecting behavior onto the other side, deflecting one's behavior onto the other side. It's actually frightening.
It is definitely double plus ungood. I think that's something that we can all agree on here. Do you think that the left and that this war against the West from the extremist part of Islam, you think that this is a situation where it's an enemy of an enemy is my friend, or do you think that they're more actively working together in a way to combat Western culture as we know it?
No, I don't think it's a situation of the enemy of my enemy. I think it's that they find common ground. They're against Judeo-Christian values.
It's interesting.
They really are. How many I don't know how many times we have to watch or read about the declarations that the Progressive Party is making about where they want to see the West heading, whether it's in Europe or here, they do not want they want class warfare. They want to completely even white men themselves who are being denigrated and being. If you look at some university campuses where the white men are told to the white male students are told to shut up, that they have nothing of use to say because of their privilege and they're being male. I mean, this is crazy stuff.
It's kind of like the conquer and divide. It's kind of like the conquer and divide thing, because I was talking to somebody. The whole notion of white privilege is really kind of terrible because it's like the left wants to convince ethnic minorities that you're less than. It kind of sells this victimhood mentality, which will create an inferiority complex within people. So if you grow up your whole life, and a lot of people don't realize how toxic this is because humans, I think we have we kind of gravitate towards people who pity us. It makes us feel good when somebody says that's just a part of humans, but it's really dangerous because it creates this inferiority complex where a lot of ethnic minorities feel disenfranchised, whether legitimate or not. That's not even the point. And a lot of it is not legitimate. And so then it's like join us on this side because we're to fight for you. But it's sad because people don't realize the toxicity that it's creating. And it's like, okay, I hate it. And kind of a lot of what you talked about in the film was like this, the West is evil because, I mean, there were a lot of sins that were committed. That's very true. However, if you really sit back and think about any civilization, all of them have done horrible things. I mean, there's not one civilization across the world's history that has not committed some atrocity. So I think we should look forward. And it's like the political left they don't want that. They don't want to move forward. They don't want to say, well, yes, these sins occurred, but we can still have a great society. It's like they want to hold America hostage to its past, and it's really destroying society in a lot of ways. So
no, it is. I mean, what we see happening now is what was the kind of hatred and singling out that used to happen only to Israel has expanded because the West allowed it the West actually allowed that to go on. It did not stand up. If we're talking about the West in general, it did not stand alongside of Israel and challenge these accusations that were being thrown at Israel. And now we see that those same kind of accusations are being made against the West in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's so hypocritical because here you have these, radical progressives on campuses and in the public square, who are saying that the West is terrible because there was slavery. Nobody, of course, is mentioning the fact that it was the West that ended slavery and that there's still slavery going on in Muslim countries.
Mm-hmm. Libya.
And in Africa. Yeah. But the West is terrible because, it had slavery, had racism, it had, misogyny. Well, how come they're not pointing their finger at what's happening in some of these Islamic countries where women are having forced female genital mutilation upon them, where gay men are being thrown off the roofs of buildings, where a thief will have his hands chopped off.
These are not Western ideals, right? And they're dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me?
These are not Western ideals, right? And that's to be expected because they're not in the West. But I think it's important to point out how dangerous these ideals are, right? And really, truly barbaric.
You're absolutely right. But what I'm saying is, the slogans and the accusations that are coming out of the progressive West against the West which are things that have happened throughout mankind, and they're only pointing at the West. These same people who are doing this are not at all concerned about what's happening to women and gays and also dissidents who speak out in these countries, in the Islamist countries, in the dictatorships, when they speak out as dissidents. And the torture that happens to them, these progressives aren't at all concerned about that.
And then also
it's very. Go ahead.
Oh, and it's also in there. They won't speak out about it. And then another thing that was interesting is pointed out in the film, and I think a lot of people in Western countries have this. We don't want to point out the obvious. They don't, like you mentioned in the film, they don't want to point out the relationship between this extremist behavior and Islam. And many times they want to import mass amounts of people from countries who are hostile, like just straight hostile to your way of life. And that isn't going to work. If you look at what's happening in Europe, and a lot of people aren't aware of that because in many European countries, they keep it out the media. And also, they don't have free speech. So when citizens speak out, they can go to jail for hate speech. Right. And it's like it's not a good idea to import mass amounts of people who are just straight hostile to your way of life and think it's going to work. And so kind of one thing I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned in the film, which I think is really important for people to remember, there's a difference between multiculturalism and multiracial. And I think that people don't understand how to separate the two. Because having a multiracial society is great, but when you have a lot of competing cultures, and it's different when you have cultures who mesh well. Like, for example, we have a lot of people coming from South America. Well, they're Catholic. So, I mean, a mass amounts of them, it's not, it's like, it works. But when you have people coming from a society where they're taught you can oppress women, you can beat women, you can kill people who change their religion, that's not going to work. And also I wanted to point to is like Linda Sansor, who was like a darling of the left. Well, this woman is horrible. Ayan, please correct me if I say her name correctly, but Ayan Hirsi Ali, I think I said her name correctly.
Yes. Yes, you did.
And Bridget Gabriel, she made, from Act for America, she made a very vulgar comment about like, doing something horrible to their genitals, like mutilating them, and which was so disgusting. Is if Ayan's story, it was more insulting, and she's like a darling of the left. They just love her. And she even got on stage and said, well, jihad means struggle, and started saying jihad was okay because she was saying it meant struggle, And she also endorsed our gubernatorial candidate, Abdul Al-Sayed, on the Democratic side. So, I mean, this woman is just, she's nuts. I mean, I don't know how to say it, but.
Yeah. I mean, when you were saying the difference between multiracialism and multiculturalism, in the film, Victor Davis Hanson is very articulate in talking and addressing that, and he explained that it used to be in this country, for example, in this country, that the goal was to have a multiracial society, but together under one e pluribus union. That we would all be American citizens. Who wanted to sustain the values of the Western values of the country, and that it works when you do that. Multiculturalism, on the other hand, doesn't promote assimilation. It doesn't promote becoming American citizens, accepting the rule of law, living under the Constitution of the United States. Multiculturalism says that you can bring your practices and your values, etc., and you can live under that. But then you never become an American, and you can't sustain. You cannot sustain a nation in that way if you do not have a people who can. It can be diverse. It's not about not having diversity. We don't all have to give up our various faiths, etc. But we also have to have as our identity that we're Americans, with the understanding that there is no law above the Constitution. And so that's the difference of what's happening today. There isn't. I mean, there are people who are coming into this country, as there are people entering Europe, who do not respect the values of the country that they are coming into. And that's not true. I'm not saying that that's true of the majority of immigrants. I'm not saying that at all. But there's a significant number, and a significant number can be a minority. It's just that it's a very vocal and hard group of people who want to come in and destroy our way of life. And that's not a multiracial population who are all living under, e pluribus unum. So that's the problem. It's a major problem, and that's really that's terrible for the citizens, and it's terrible for the immigrants who came here because they want to live in the freedoms that the West offers.
I think
and
that
so it gets ruined for them too.
Gloria, that's a great point you just mentioned, that because we want to really emphasize our point isn't to say ever that all Muslims are. That's not what we're saying. But like you said, there's a minority. And when you have a religion that has about, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe 1 billion adherents, even 10%, that's still 100 million people. So even that small minority, they make life miserable for the other ones who left their home country to get away with that. Because one of the things that we need to remember, and two things, is that in a lot of the Islamic nations, the extremists attack the ones who don't want to join in with them. So they don't just attack Christians and Jews. They attack other Muslims who don't want to wage jihad on other people. And that's the really sad part. And I feel like sometime in our news media, me and Mike were kind of talking about this before the show, is that we focus so much on these terrorist attacks in Western countries. And unfortunately, we ignore the ones that occur in the Middle East. And we ignore the ones that occur within Africa and Asia. So we don't really understand what we're dealing with. But if we paid attention to those in Boko Haram and what's going on in Egypt, when the Coptic church is being blown up and all these different things, if we paid attention, or I was reading like a year ago about in Burma, a group of Buddhist monks were fighting back against Islamic extremism. So if we see that this is, like you mentioned in the film, as part of a larger narrative, then we would really understand that folks like us, we're not crazy. Like, is something going on here,
Yeah, it's a global issue. But I also want to say that it's not just one of the things that the film makes a point of is that we're facing two threats. We're facing a threat from within, an internal threat, and we're facing an external threat. So, we've spoken now about the threat of jihad, the threat of terrorism. But when we look at the internal threat, we come to understand that it's the internal threat that make us more vulnerable to the external threats. If we were unified as citizens of our Western countries, if we understood, if we were properly educated in the history of Western civilization, if we knew, unfortunately today it's something like, I think it's 70, I can't remember if it's either 70, somewhere between 75 and 85% of college graduates have not studied the Constitution. So when you're younger, when you're in college, you're still trying to figure things out for yourself, and you can and you're vulnerable to getting swept up by radical movements. And a lot of times you find these young people on the street rioting, etc. And when you try to get them to tell you what their complaint is, what they want to see happen, they really can't talk about it. They can only shout out slogans at you. And I think that there are things that we in the West can do going forward to diminish that, to educate. We used to schools used to have courses, both high schools and universities used to have programs on Western civilization, and that's really not happening anymore. Good news is that there are independent institutes that have been opening up that do teach and study and write about Western civilization and educate about the Constitution, etc. But we don't have a lot of time. I mean, it's not like, I don't think that we can sustain ourselves by just coming up with long-term strategies. We have to do something now, and we have to look to the future as well. But we have to really do something about these threats to freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We have to do something about the kind of behavior that is happening where there's no longer a respect for a two-party system in this country, where you have a progressive party wanting to destroy the opposition. Opposition is very important for a healthy society. You can't sustain yourself on one party without becoming a dictatorship. It's the notion of balance, of checks and balances. Having more than one party is part of that, because it also relates to the marketplace of ideas. That's why in this country we don't censor what people may refer to as hate speech. Instead, we show in the marketplace that those hate speeches are wrong by giving by articulating what we feel is right, and it'll work itself out in the marketplace of ideas. But we're seeing now, mutterings about, and actually we're seeing implementation. People in this country are not, thank God, are not yet being arrested for saying something that a self-identifying victims group say is hate and hate speech and harming them. But there's things are happening in the public square and on college campuses where students or individuals are being ostracized for articulating their perspective, when the other side is free to say whatever they want. There was no pushback in Durham, North Carolina, when the Durham Town Council just passed a boycott resolution against companies that were working with Israel. Mm-hmm. And then a leader from the Nation of Islam spoke, and this was you could see the footage on YouTube. And he thanked the town council for passing the resolution to boycott these companies who were working with Israel, and he started talking about the synagogue of Satan and how the Jews want to control everything. He was saying stuff that came right out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He's saying Nazi propaganda. And Nation of Islam, Farrakhan's Nation of Islam is the most hateful, it's Jew-hating organization out there. And nobody on the progressive side will say anything about it. They will, and as a matter of fact, the leaders of the Women's March, they all embrace them.
And yeah, that's like I was mentioning. Like I was mentioning earlier about like Linda's son Stewart. They totally embrace her, and it's like, are you kidding me? And again, it's worthy of noting she did endorse one of the Democratic nominees for governor in Michigan. It's worthy to note that this woman, who is a fan of Sharia law, who stood up and defended jihad because she said it means struggle, she endorsed one of our gubernatorial candidates. And again, the media tries to downplay us like it's a bunch of Islamophobia. No, this woman is very clear in what she's saying. But also, I kind of couple of things is that, just to clarify the audience, when you speak of the Nation of Islam, you're talking about Louis Farrakhan's organization.
Yes,
So, yes,
yes,
just so the audience can be clear on who you're talking about. And he has said some
yes.
very off-color comments because in some of the things the media feels like you can't criticize him because he's black. And that's just the reality of it. You can't say that what he's saying is horrible. You just got to kind of be like, oh, well, that comes where it's like with this victimization that people can just say and do anything as long as they belong to one of these approved groups. But also when you talk about the threat from within, I did want to kind of ask you, because we're pushing on time here, but you talked about like the rise of secularization and the attack on masculinity. I think that's something extremely important for you to talk about with the audience because when you destroy the family, you destroy a civilization. And it's like
Yes.
because of this postmodern idea that everything is relative and it's these, everything is relative to the culture and the time. But there are some inherent things that men and women are totally hardwired differently. And whether it's cross-culturally, cross-continentally, I can't even speak right, cross-continent, cross-time, you see some common themes amongst men and women. So we're hardwired to be a certain way. So can you speak about why the left is so attacking masculinity and the detrimental effects that it's having on our culture?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think with the exception of Bill Cosby, who happens to be a conservative, and I'm not saying that Bill Cosby is not guilty of any of the charges. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that with the exception of him, most of the denigration and demonization of the male is being targeted at white men. And a lot of these white men are becoming very complacent and obedient, like they will be quiet. And they'll say, well, I've heard so many like young college students say, well, my opinion doesn't really matter because of my white privilege. The fact is that there's an essential nature to female and essential nature to male. And there is a reason why there used to be a code of chivalry. The code of chivalry developed and existed as a system for men to really understand what men's responsibilities are. And the code of chivalry grooms men to be gentlemen. And there were a few periods in history where chivalry was just denigrated and thrown back in a closet someplace, and it would come back again. But as Mark Tapson explains in the film, during the World War I and the rise of feminism, chivalry was considered to be sexist because men would open doors for women and try to be gentlemen. So that got totally destroyed. No chivalry is allowed anymore. If a man opens a door for a woman, a feminist will, denigrate him for doing that. So then what do you see happening? You see, if you tell a group of people that they have no worth, that they're terrible, they're just like horrible, and that they just need to, castrate themselves, some of them will become very timid, and some of them will become very angry. And at the same time, there's an attitude going on that women should just be able to dress however we want. Now, I have absolutely no problem with not being covered up. I would never cover myself up, and I'm not saying that women have to wear sleeves. But when you look at just look at the Academy Awards, and you see that there are women at the Academy Awards that are really like pretty much half naked. right?
No, it's true.
And then you see, and you see that happening throughout society, that and there's no sense of consequence. There's no sense of common sense of you can't if you can't go out, you can't walk half naked around the street and expect that you're going to be safe.
And I also think it's also important to mention that, yeah, in the film you talked about like the feminism, like the kind of Marxist attitude, but it's really important. I think kind of we're talking about there's inherent nature to men and women. Like women have been reducing themselves to like a cheap commodity. Almost like in a lot of these feminists, they actually reduce women to your value as only your sexuality. Like me and my cousins kind of make a joke, like Helen Gurley Brown, who was the editor of Cosmo, like sold us a lie. So many women thought being promiscuous and exposing yourself was empowering, but it's actually denigrating. And then a lot of women like, well, why do men treat me so bad? Well, look what you have reduced yourself to, and they don't understand the nature of the beast of men and women. So it's like women have cheapened themselves, and so it's empowerment to expose yourself, and that's actually belittling to a lot of young girls who see, well, to be a woman, to be all these things, I must behave a certain way. It's the book I read in college called Female Chauvinist Pig. And it was a really, really great book, and it really touched on this subject. Like, women are selling themselves short. And so the attack on masculinity is also coming simultaneously while this thing like, female empowerment is being promiscuous. It has just the most detrimental effects on our society and on the family structure when we start telling women that being promiscuous is empowering. And I see so many of my friends who walked around with this mindset, and then they find themselves in a situation where they're being totally exploited by their partner. So it's a problem. Right. It's a problem.
I actually think that there's a relationship between that and secularization, because there's not an understanding in sexuality from a biblical perspective is a sacred thing. It's a sacred thing between a man and a woman, husband and wife, right? It's not something that you just go. It's not something to entertain yourself with, and it's no longer considered sacred. It's now considered whatever you want to do. Whatever you want to do.
What other kind of impacts
has young women don't understand how degrading that is to themselves.
Like a cheap commodity. I do want to say something, Gloria, really quickly before we move on to the next point. As I was discussing something with some friends of mine, but if you look at human history, and when you mentioned about the Judeo-Christian values, when you looked at human history, before a man could get a woman, which meant get sex and a wife, he ultimately had to prove he could do all these different things, which meant being a man. And so now when we kind of cheapened ourselves, well, they have no motivation to be those things, and ultimately society collapsed because he had to prove himself to the father and to all these different men first. Then he got the woman, and then he was quote unquote a man. But nowadays, not only do so many women give them the sex, but they also give them money and all types of other things. So we can really see how this attack on masculinity and trying to weaken men has not just hurt men, but it seems to hurt women a lot as well.
Yeah, no, it hurts society. I mean, there has to be a respect. There has to be a respect between men and women. We can't sustain society with a gender war. And that was one of the things that Ruth Weiss spoke about in the section of the film on weaponizing identity, which is that rather than women being grateful for the advances that have happened, dealing with infertility, dealing with suffrage, all that, and instead it becomes a politic of guilt and blame, and you can't have a healthy society with that. We have to, if in a sense, what's happening is that the human drive for continuity is diminished. If you look at the birth rate, younger generations today are not thinking about their responsibility to sustain human life, and in a sense, that's civilizational suicide.
It is.
So it's the me generation is only thinking about oneself and not having a sense of responsibility to society, to community. It's there's so many different aspects of sort of anarchy that has been sort of developing in our society as rule of law gets denounced, as biblical morality gets denounced. We're dealing with anarchy, really.
So we've talked about the birth rate declining due to secularization, and also the effects, obviously, of sex and secularization on Western society. What else? What else has secularization done to Western society that's maybe less than good? Or is that just enough all by itself?
There's a variety. There are many different religious systems out there, and even within religions, there's denominations within them. But one of the reasons why religious systems are so important is because it helps people understand the meaning of life. And it also reminds people, and I'm not saying that there's a pragmatic reason to sustain religions. I happen to be a person of faith. But when I look at people who don't have faith, and I look at sort of like what's happening in our societies, which are becoming very secularized. And again, I think that people, individuals have a right to whatever their belief system is, including no religion. But if there's no religion, then it's very important that they develop a system to make sure that they maintain their civilized behavior. But there's no account when you don't have that. You have no accountability to a higher. I don't want to say being, to anything higher
purpose,
than
maybe,
yourself.
to a higher purpose in life. So I'll come out of the closet here as a secular myself, right, and say that it's not impossible to be a good person and a secular at the same time. But
it's absolutely. I mean, I have so many friends who identify themselves as being, secular, but they're good people because they follow an ethical standard that they've adopted. I mean, they're good people. So I'm not saying that one has to be a person of faith to be a good person, but you have to live by moral guidelines.
Definitely.
Whether they come out of a religion or not. And religious societies that promote freedom and promote, liberty, they in a way, it provides a structure, it provides accountability, it provides the understanding that there's consequence to one's behavior.
Certainly.
If you don't feel that there's consequence to any behavior and that you can do whatever you want,
it leaves a lot of room for problems and errors in society.
A what society?
It leaves a lot of room for errors and problems in society if you have no moral guidelines, right? But with that, we are almost out of time. So with our last 60 seconds here, I want to talk about how people can actually see the documentary and how they can see you. So we're definitely going to post up to the Facebook page a preview or at least a quick 30-second ad of the show. But if they want to see the full show, the full documentary, or if they want to see you in person, how can they best do that?
Well, they can do that by attending the screening that's happening at Crossings on May 7th. Do you have the address in front of you?
Yep, it's 2075 Walnut Lake Road in West Bloomfield, Michigan, 48322.
Okay, and you'll post a number that they can call to register?
Yep, and there is a link which I have got tickets from, and I'll be sure to post that on the Facebook page. So please come out if you guys would like to watch the film, meet Gloria, and Mike and myself will be there if you want to meet us too.
Gloria, thank you so much for your time today.
Can I say one more thing? If there are people who can't, who because of their schedule, they can't attend the screening, they can go on the film's website, which you'll post, right? It's
Definitely.
thefightofourlives.com, and they can watch the trailer, and they can also order a DVD. But I would love for everybody to come on March 7th. We'll have a very engaging Q&A, and it's wonderful to see the film on a big screen.
All right. Gloria, thank you very much for
Thank you,
your time.
Gloria.
And thanks, everybody, for listening in.
Have a wonderful day. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.